Hello everyone, welcome to another video with Yoseka. Today I'm going to be testing out many different planner papers so that you don't have to. Today I have tested already different planners and their papers and how different inks and pens, markers, etc. perform on them. There were a lot of planner paper changes going into the 2025 year, so I thought it would be a great idea to show you all how regular inks perform on these papers so you can get a good idea of what you're looking at for the upcoming year. So most of these are well, you can see there's a lot here. And so if you want to skip around in the video player, there will be timestamps. Feel free to skip to a section that interests you the most. But the basic format of this video is I'm going to explain the planners that I'm testing and what paper they had, what it's changed to, what's significant about their paper, and then I will go through my testing regimen, the different inks and pens and markers that I am putting on the paper to really put it through the ringer, and then I will go over my testing criteria, like what I'm looking for and how I'm kind of measuring how well these inks and the paper do, per se. So that is going to be the basic video, and since it's going to be long, I will get right into it. All right, so here's the big stack of planners, and the first one that we're testing here is the Hobonichi Cousin. And for 2025, Hobonichi has finally solidified all of their paper is the same Tomoe River S paper. And usually people are very curious about how it's different to the old paper, but I just thought I would test this one today. I don't have a previous year's version, so I'll be testing the Hobonichi Cousin. This is the Avec, actually, but they all have the same paper now, so I'll be showing you in a regular Cousin. And then this is the Take-A-Note from 2024, actually. This one did not have a paper change this year. Take-A-Note still has the same Tomoe River paper as they had in the previous year, but a lot of people always ask me to test the Tomoe River paper in this one because it is 68 GSM, which just means that it's a little bit thicker than the Cousin's Tomoe River paper. So this one is thicker, and people always ask me if it actually performs differently than this one, so we will also test that for this reason. I do have to note that the bi-weekly, this one, the Slim Bi-Week planner from Take-A-Note, actually uses the same 52 GSM, so you can reference that for this one. It's the only one that's different from them. This 68 GSM also appears in their A5 and B6 planners. So those are all our Tomoe River paper planners. Then next we have the Hightide Légende de l'année, and this one had a paper change from, I'm not sure what it was called before, but a lot of people found that their previous paper was not super fountain pen friendly, so Hightide decided to change all of their planner papers, so it's completely new this year and is supposed to be way more fountain pen friendly, and it's called PasPier paper. So I'm excited to test this one and show you the results. Then here we have the Jibun Techos. This here I have the Lite, which uses the thin paper, but the thin paper can also be found in the Jibun Techo Days, and it's used in other items as well. So this is just a good reference to have. It's not like this is a new paper. This has been around, but since it's our first year carrying Jibun Techo, I thought many people would be curious to see this tested as well. And then the Biz has the Kokuyo Mio paper. So this is also a paper that's very commonly used. It's been around. Kokuyo uses it in many different things, but it's also used in the standard or first kit for the Jibun Techo, so I thought this would be a good comparison between the two Kokuyo papers as well. Next we have the PAL planner. This also had a big paper change from the Kokuyo Mio paper, which, from the Jibun Techo, was actually used in the previous two editions of the PAL, but this year it has been changed to a Japanese paper, unknown who the manufacturer is, but it is 79 GSM, which is thicker. So this one was specifically chosen because it's supposed to be a little bit thicker, obviously, but also better with different stamps, markers, gel pens, and those kind of things that are more commonly used in this type of, in the more tracker-oriented planner. You tend to use markers and gel pens a lot more in this planner, so that's why this one was chosen for this from the unknown manufacturer. And then last but not least, we have the Hours Project Research Journal. This one, I know a lot of people really loved the paper in the previous editions for this one, so I thought it would be great to test the new paper, which is the HUWA paper. It is also a Japanese paper, and it has like a very similar thickness to the previous edition, which I believe was called Birds of a Feather, something like that paper. I'll put a correction here if I'm wrong. But this one, it feels similar, so I'm excited to see how this performs. So those are all of our planners, so many. And now I will go through the testing regimen. So I know most people are very curious about the fountain pen inks, so that's what I'm testing mostly here. I have 5 different fountain pen inks that all test a different quality of the ink. And then I have a ballpoint pen, a gel pen, a brush marker, which is made out of water-based pigment ink, a highlighter, which I overlaid twice here so you can see what happens when you like go over and highlight something more than once. And then I also used an oil-based stamp. These I chose for very specific reasons, which I will go over in the testing criteria. But I think some things that I should note here are these inks. This is Manyo Fuji, which is really well known for shading. And this is Ink Institute's Shadow Snow, which is really well known for its sheen. The Diamine Cinnabon is really well known for feathering, actually. A lot of people have said this to us in passing over time. And then this is the Pilot Irisuzuku Ajisai ink, which is a pretty well-known, like well-behaved wet ink. And then this is just a very standard black ink. It should be pretty standard and representative of anyone if they just want to use a simple blue, black ink in their planner in a pretty regular sized nib, not something too broad. And then this is the Jetstream ink, which is an oil-based ballpoint ink, usually pretty not fussy, but good to see how much it shows through the paper sometimes because it's usually a pretty dark ink. Same with the gel pen, it's just a different formulation. It's a water-based ink rather than an oil-based ink. This is a 0.5 pen. Both of these are 0.5 because it's very like right in the middle. Otherwise I'd have to go through and test like, 0.38, 0.7, all these other ones. So I think this is most standard for what people use. And then this is the Fudenosuke, which is a pretty popular brush pen people like to use in their planners because it's not too broad, pretty good for titles and whatnot. The mild liner is also a pretty standard highlighter that people like to use. And oil-based ink tends to show through, and it's also a good measure of like smudging, even though I'm not testing that explicitly. So this is the regimen. This is what I did on every single piece of paper. You'll see I have this here too. This is actually MD paper. This is the Travelers 2024. You can see that I tested on. MD paper has not changed, so this is a pretty standard representative test for fountain pen friendly paper on this MD paper here. I also have this test that I did on standard printer paper, so we can see what it looks like on non-fountain pen friendly paper. And this will be relevant once I go into the testing criteria, which is right now. So for the testing criteria, these are the things that I wanted to look at. The first thing here is actually ink quality, and that's something that I look at with these two inks here. For shading, it's how many different color changes we can see and how vibrant they are. So for Sailor Manyo Fuji, you can see pretty vibrant pinks, you can see pretty deep blues and greens in this very gradated change here. So that's what I'm looking for shading. And then sheening is this quality where the ink has almost like an oil slick to it. So you can kind of see there in the light, it changes from blue to red. It's got that sheen to it, a oil slick type of sheen. Ooh, that's really bright there. So that's like what I'm looking for, how intense that red sheen is. Does it show up? How vibrant is it? Those are the things that I'm looking for ink quality, is mainly the color variation and how vibrant those are. And what you can see here is on a fountain pen friendly paper, those aspects of an ink, those qualities will show up, and on a non-fountain pen friendly paper, they will not. They will not show up at all. Maybe like a little bit here, you can see there's some variation between purple and blue, but not nearly as much as on here. So this is kind of my range, like not fountain pen friendly, fountain pen friendly. And then the next criteria that I'm testing this on is feathering. So feathering is something that happens when the ink kind of penetrates and spreads to the surrounding fibers, and it leaves you with these kind of fuzzy, not super crisp looking lines. And again, this is on the non-fountain pen friendly paper. So the top one is Manya Fuji, and you can see the feathering is spreading a lot to the surrounding fibers. And underneath is the Sailor black ink. And even though it's happening less, you can still see that there is some feathering. So my measure for measuring feathering is just whether or not it happens. No matter how big or how small it is, if it's happening, I want to try and see and point it out, even if it's a little bit like this, because I know that can bother people. Then next is testing ghosting, also known as show-through. This is actually just the aspect of when you turn the paper over, how much that ink shows through, how much you can see a ghost of the image on the other side. This tends to be more severe with thinner papers. So this paper is the non-fountain pen friendly printer paper, and you can see on the thinner ND paper, the ghosting is a little bit more with these. You can see the writing on the other side, but it's not so bad. Like, it wouldn't bother me if I had to write over this, but if this is happening, I will point it out. If you see it less, like this, I'll make sure to point that out. If you can see it more, if it goes more, I'll make sure to point that out too. The last aspect that I will be testing is bleed through. Now, this is what happens when usually a paper cannot absorb the ink adequately, and it will literally bleed through to the other side of the paper. So when we turn it over, you can actually see it up here too. This is like way more significant, but I think this is more commonly what will happen with markers or with stamps. So that's what I'll be testing here. And you can see on the fountain pen friendly paper that it's not happening, maybe very slightly with this stamp, but usually pretty good. So that's my measure. Are there any little blotches, and how severe is it for the bleed through? Okay, first up we have our Hobonichi cousin. This is using the Tomoe River 52 GSM paper by Sanzen. And this is how it looks. The ink performs quite well, honestly, in my opinion. Like, you can see every single different color of the shading ink, and you can definitely see that red shine of the Sheening ink. So that's a 10 out of 10 for me on the ink quality. For the feathering, this is also quite good. I don't see any feathering there whatsoever on the ink that is known to feather versus the wet ink. They both seem very, very crisp to me. So good on the feathering. Same with all the rest of these. There doesn't seem to be any feathering at all. Now let's look for the ghosting and bleed through. So on the back side, there's definite ghosting. This is expected with the Tomoe River paper that's 52 GSM because it's very thin. I don't know if you can kind of get a feel for it, but it's like very, very thin. And so you'll definitely see it on the back side, but no bleed through, not even on these larger ink swatches, so that's good. But I do see a little bit of the beginnings of some bleed through with this stamp. You can see it's like almost like if I had pressed harder, it might bleed through a little bit. There's like some little dots of possible bleed through. It didn't quite happen here, but it's definitely something to be aware of, possible bleed through with oil-based ink stamps. So that is the Cousins paper. Next we have the Take a Note with the Tomoe River 68 GSM paper. And this is how this looks. Again, we have really great shading and sheen ink quality. Sometimes it's hard to get the light to show the correct angle to see the sheening, but it's definitely there. I think it's as strong as the other Tomoe River paper. So you can see they both sheen very nicely. And I will say the shading seems like slightly less, but it might just be because I had more ink pooled here. I think you can definitely still see all the different colors that come out in the ink, but it's interesting that the 52 GSM Tomoe River has like really, really great ink quality showing through. The 68 GSM is still really good, don't get me wrong, it's still good, but I think it's interesting that there is a slight difference. And then for feathering, let's take a look. No feathering that I can see on the 68 Tomoe River. Same with all of the rest of the inks. But I do have to note that this did smudge a little bit. So that is something to take note of. This paper probably takes longer to dry when you put ink on it, so that might be why this is happening. And then for the ghosting on the back, not bad at all. This is a thicker paper. 68 GSM is thicker than 52 GSM, so the amount of ghosting is way, way less, which is very nice to see. And there's absolutely no bleed through for anything. This looks really good to me. So if you're worried about bleed through with anything, the 68 GSM Tomoe River performs really nicely. All right, next we have the Hightide PasPier paper. And this was a nice surprise for me as well. It shows the shading and sheening ink quality very nicely. It shows a little bit less than the Tomoe River paper. So you can see that the Tomoe River paper definitely has way more shading and sheening going on. The pinks are brighter and the dark greens are darker, and the sheen is much more potent and red compared to this one. It seems like this paper absorbed it a little bit quicker than the Tomoe River paper, but it still performed quite nicely. As far as the feathering goes, I don't see any here, which is very nice. On any of the inks, no feathering and no smudging on this stamp. For the ghosting and bleed through on the back, also almost nothing. The ghosting is very, very minimal, which is nice. This is a thicker paper. I don't know what GSM it is, but it is thicker than the Tomoe River paper. It feels more similar to the 68 GSM. And I think the stamp ghosts the most, but there's no bleed through at all for it, which is very nice. So very nice all-around performance from the Hightide PasPier paper, which is now in all of their planners. I'm just gonna keep the Tomoe River paper here because it's a really good comparison for the ink quality. Up next, we have the Jibun Techo Lite planner with the Kokuyo thin paper. So this is what we have for the Kokuyo thin paper. It shows the shading and sheening really, really well. Like that is the exact same, I'd say. So it's got all the sheen on it as well. It's very, very bright red, especially in person. I'm not sure how well it actually picks up on camera, but this is very nice. I don't see any feathering for this as well for any of the inks. No feathering. But it does look like the oil-based stamp did smudge a little bit, which makes sense because there tends to be a correlation between how well a paper is able to show off the shading and sheening ink qualities of a fountain pen ink and how much it will smudge, because these papers tend to be slightly more coated, so it takes a little bit longer for inks to dry on them. On the back, the ghosting, you can see a little bit. This is a thinner paper. And the bleed through, there is like a very slight amount of bleed through on this stamp here. You can see just a couple of dots of it. It's really not too bad. I'd say this is very similar to the Tomoe River 52 GSM paper in its performance across the board. So That's quite nice, actually. Up next is the Jibun Techo Biz Planner, which uses the Kokuyo Mio paper. And again, it does show the shading and sheening qualities, but I can see there's kind of this fuzziness happening here. And the pinks are not quite as bright here, and the darkest greens are not as dark there. So it maybe might not show shading as well, but the sheening is definitely showing up. Like I can see that there. As far as feathering goes, there is a little bit, but it's so slight. If it bothers you, you might be able to notice it, but it's so slight. I don't even know if it'll show up on camera for the Cinnabon and Ajisai inks. The rest of the inks do not feather, and there doesn't seem to be any smudging like there was on the Kokuyo thin paper. Let's take a look at the ghosting on the back. So this one actually has less ghosting than the thin paper. You can see these show up less. This is the Mio paper, this is the thin paper. The ghosting is less on this one. And the bleed through is also less, so this must be a thicker paper. The Mio paper must be a little bit thicker than the Kokuyo thin paper, which is very interesting. So here are those two side by side, the thin paper on the left and the Mio paper on the right. Okay, now we have the PAL. So Bushimen did say in a video that she made that she chose this paper because of how well she wanted it to handle regular inks like this, because most people do tend to use highlighters, markers, stamps in this planner, since it is a more habit tracking kind of based planner. But the fountain pen quality, I have to say, is really not the best for this one. There's almost no shading or sheening showing up at all, and both of these inks are feathering. So not sure that this would be the best choice if you want to use only fountain pens. Maybe if you want to use a thin fountain pen, it would be fine because this fine pen does work. And all of these other pens and the stamp, as promised, do not feather and look very nice. Let's see the ghosting and bleed through. Okay, well, there is some bleed through on these inks. The ghosting is pretty minimal when it comes to the ballpoint gel markers and the stamp even. I think this is one of the least ghosting and bleed through stamps that we've seen so far, maybe similar to the Hightide paper. So this one, it looks like not super recommended for fountain pen inks unless you're using a finer nib, maybe extra fine, medium fine. Medium even might work if you're using like a regular ink, but these don't seem to perform super well. And then all your regular markers and pens seem to perform great. So that is the PAL. Last but not least, we have the Hours Research Journal. And this is actually my research journal that I am purchasing this year. So I did the swatch all the way in the back. Okay, so it looks like the shading shows the darker colors, but not the lighter colors, if that makes sense. If we compare it to the Tomoe River paper 52 GSM here, these pinks are brighter than these. And I don't see a lot of green showing up here, whereas you can see more green here, but it does seem to show the color variation. So the shading is like, that's a 50-50 for me. And then the sheening definitely does show up here, so that's nice. The sheening quality can be seen. Maybe a little bit less strong, but it's definitely there. You can definitely see that shine there. So it's like a 50-60%. 6 out of 10 for me for these. And then the feathering, I do not see any feathering. This looks very crisp to me. Down the line looks very crisp. I do see a little bit of this smudging here, so this paper might take slightly longer to dry. Let's look at the ghosting. Yeah, ghosting is pretty minimal with this one. I think the marker, maybe you can see the most. And it doesn't look like there's any bleed through on the back. I think I see slightly, maybe very slightly for the stamp. You can be the judge if you think that that is showing bleed through, but it's really minimal to me. It seems pretty good all around for this one. Just maybe a little bit lower on the shading ink performance end. Okay, so that is all of the planners that we have tested. My final thoughts on all of these, I think they could be sorted into two categories. Like if you're a really big fan of fountain pen inks and you want to make sure that the ink quality is showing up on everything with minimal feathering, minimal ghosting, and show through, I recommend the Cousin, the Jibun Techo Lite or Days, something with the thin paper, the Techo, or the Hightide planners. These all seem to have really nice fountain pen friendly paper. Not that the other ones don't necessarily. Kokuyo Mio paper was good with fountain pen, and the Hours Research Journal was good with fountain pen, just showed slightly less ink quality on those. As for other journal users, if you just want to stick to a simple fountain pen or a simple, like thin, fine fountain pen, or you just want to stick to ballpoint gel highlighters, I think any of these actually work really well. If you like to use stamps, I would say your best bet are these two, the PAL and the Jibun Techo Biz, which has the Mio paper. These two seem to handle the stamps really well. They don't have smudging and they don't bleed through to the back. So these two seem to be the best for stamps, but they all seem to handle the stamps really well with just like slight bleed through on the back. I think the Kokuyo thin paper has the most like slight bleed through. Like if it really bothers you, I think the Kokuyo thin paper, maybe possibly the Cousin, you could like get away with it. Just don't stamp your stamps too hard. You know what I mean? So, or you could use a different ink, like a chalk-based stamp ink, something like that. So, those are my final thoughts on these planners. Let me know if you found any results that seem to be different than mine, or if there's another round of this that you want to test. Like, for example, we didn't test smudging explicitly because you have to do really specific timed testing for when you smudge the ink and for how long you let it dry, stuff like that. So I thought it would be too much for this video, but if you want to see it, let me know in the comments, and if there's anything else that you'd ever want to see tested on planner paper, feel free to let us know. And if you have any questions, also ask us down there. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!